in front of us again the lead reviewers for the Strategic Defence Review, namely Lord Robertson, who was the lead reviewer for the Strategic Defence Review, and also wonderful to welcome back General Sir Richard Barrons, also a reviewer of the Strategic Defence Review. Unfortunately, Fiona Hill, the other reviewer, could not join us today, but no doubt we will welcome her in the near future to get her perspective on the DIP. Gents, we've had a lot of discussion on the Defence Investment Plan over the last few months. I know all of us have been pushing for the publication of that. Unfortunately, it was substantially delayed for several months. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the DIP itself, what do you think have been the key impacts of the delay of the DIP? And in your view, could some of those have been avoided or managed better? Lord Robertson?
I think the delay has caused a degree of confusion inside the Ministry of Defence and considerable disturbance in the industry as well, who had waited for this to take place. But that will be compounded by their disappointment at the actual plan itself when it came out, and its inability to project forward the commitment to the 3.5% that the government has already said is its objective. So industry will undoubtedly have been affected, slowed down, and in fact some companies will have gone bust in the process as they waited for the degree of certainty that was required. In our view, we built this Strategic Defence Review based on an assessment of 10 years. That was our assessment at the time for when a peer opponent might challenge the United Kingdom. That clearly has now been accelerated, and quite simply we're running out of years, and the reality is that the challenge is now bigger, more serious and earlier than we had anticipated, and yet the Defence Investment Plan itself doesn't come up to it. I would say, however, that what is encouraging is that our Strategic Defence Review remains the model. It remains the outline plan for the future, and therefore doesn't need to be revised or redone. It's still there, and it's still serious, and it is transformational. And if it's carried out properly, then both industry and people in the ministry itself will be given heart.
General Barrons, what are your views on the delay and the effect on industry, which Lord Robertson has just alluded to?
I think the delay was significant. First of all, the SDR articulated a narrative for the restoration and transformation of UK defence as part of NATO for war in the 21st century, and that built a sense of expectation and relief. And then there's a year where pretty much nothing that cost any money that wasn't already programmed didn't happen. And so within the armed forces there was a sense of, well, that looked good, but is it really going to happen? Secondly, it's depleted the defence industrial base, because the small and medium-sized companies that read the SDR and thought, well, they're going to buy our thing now, then found that any prospect of a sale was perhaps even 4 years away.
Yeah.
And so those companies, like reaction engines, for example, went out of business, or they found money in America or Germany, and they've gone. And that will mean that when the MOD does buy their stuff, they'll be importing it from abroad in some cases. It caused consternation in the city, which is ready to help, that couldn't get a demand signal, and capital is very impatient, and it has started to wander off. But for me, by far, the most dangerous consequence of the year's delay is that the Prime Minister says Russia could attack NATO by 2030, and we essentially lost a year of mobilising for that, and that is profoundly dangerous.
Okay, fair enough, and I've raised that issue directly on the floor of the House as well. But Lord Robertson, I want to come to yourself. We've mentioned about the impact on industry, But what do you think that this has done with respect to our relations with allies and with partners? How do you think that the delay has had, what impact has that had on that?
I think our allies are dismayed at how long it has taken to go from the SDR, which they thought was brilliantly done and an ideal model, designed to inspire them as well as to intimidate our enemies, and therefore the delay in putting the flesh on the bones of that, I think, would have confused them as well. So the Prime Minister is in Ankara today at the NATO summit, and he'll be sitting tomorrow morning beside President Trump in alphabetical order around the North Atlantic Council table. And I think relations may well be quite frosty. And the allies round the table, who are all stepping up to the mark and who are all now spending more on defence. And of course some of the bigger countries like Germany and Poland are spending considerably more than we are spending. I think the delay and the reality will have disturbed and made uncomfortable a lot of our allies who have expected more of the United Kingdom, given that we have always claimed to have a leading role in NATO.
Okay, General Barrons, let me play devil's advocate in the sense that it could be said that you've come out to criticise the government for something that you were very much a part of, in that you were involved, you were the government's team, you were involved in collating everything that was supposed to be a costed plan. It was also the fact that you were given an envelope and everything was based on that, and yet you were a part of the team that didn't quite deliver on that. How would you respond to that?
No, I totally reject it. We were asked two questions. One is, what do you have to do to fix UK defence for war in the 21st century? And that's the narrative of the SDR, which holds good in any setting. And as Lord Robertson has described, it's regarded as globally pace-setting. The second question we were asked is, well, and what do you get for this money? And when we started out in July 24, the financial profile that we had was set to, well, you'll get to 2.9% of GDP by 29-30, and then it flatlines. This is no exercise in more money. So as we worked through the consequences of that in partnership with the MOD, which is the only place you're going to get the information from, it became clear that profile meant a brilliant narrative and enormous cuts. Right. And then in early 25, largely thanks to President Trump and his effect on NATO, that financial profile changed, so that over 10 years, that narrative was broadly implementable. There were going to be squeezes. So when we signed off the review, we were clear the narrative was the right one and accepted by government. The programme that delivered that narrative over 10 years and a bit more got you to a minimal place in 10 years. And then we said, but we think the world will mean you have to go faster and you have to find more money sooner. And as Lord Robertson has described, my goodness, over the last year, that has been the case. So we said, this SDR, we think, starts too late, nothing happens for 2 years, then goes too slowly in this Parliament, and then takes too long. And that remains the case today.
Lord Robertson, you're not to blame for this. You were part of the government's SDR team, and yet it's the fault of ministers and the Prime Minister and the Chancellor for not delivering. You think that you are not to be blamed for any of this?
No, I don't see why we should in any way be blamed. We produced a prospectus based on what we knew at that time. But we said in the reviewer's preface to the SDR, we said we are confident that the transformation we propose for the harder world we now live in is affordable over 10 years, given these promised new resources. That is the 3% by the new Parliament. However, as we live in such turbulent times, it may be necessary to go faster. The plan we have put forward can be accelerated for either greater assurance or for mobilisation of defence in a crisis. Right. So since we wrote the report, and while they were debating the defence investment plan, we had the conflict in the Gulf, which the United Kingdom is playing a serious part. We've had the coalition of the willing being invented led by Britain and other European countries following any ceasefire in Ukraine, as well as a number of other disturbing incidents that have all happened since then, as well as...
And further to your comment that you actually proposed to the government that they should reach 3% by the end of this Parliament. Is that something, just to confirm?
These were the assumptions that we had, that we had to operate within 2.5%, but the Chancellor was saying that it would be 3% at the beginning of the next Parliament, so beyond their control.
So because that hasn't, unfortunately, despite the likes of me pushing and prodding and others in the House as well, we never have got to a position where the government has stated that it will reach 3% by the end of this Parliament, or indeed 3% by 2030. I believe my colleague Emma Leal wanted to come in on this as well.
Thanks, Chair. Morning, both. Just a quick question. Were yourselves or Fiona Hill involved in the DIP planning in the discussions with government or not?
No.
No. Did you ask to be?
It was made very clear when we delivered the review that was the end of our remit.
Right.
And the conversion of the Strategic Defence Review into the programme of activity known as the DIP was always going to be done without us.
Okay, and are you happy about that? Did you not feel that was a bit of a disconnect? If you've created the document that then the DIP flows from, should you not have been involved at some stage?
Well, it was made absolutely clear to us by the then Defence Secretary, and I think I repeated the statement to this committee the last time we sat here, that our job was finished. So I was out, and so was Richard, proselytising about what we'd actually come to, but we were not involved. Apart from one briefing that we had a briefing on the delivery of the 62 recommendations. So they invited Dr. Hill, Richard and I to come to the Ministry of Defence, and we were given a fairly optimistic and a convincing view about the recommendations that were being implemented, but at no point were we ever involved in the DIP process.
You know, when you were invited in to discuss the delivery of the 62 recommendations, that was quite some time ago, wasn't it?
February or March, wasn't it?
Yeah, earlier this year, but it was at a time when the MOD, I think, felt they were quite close to settling on the DIP, and in the end they weren't.
Right. Okay. Thank you much.
Right,
Alex Baker.
I'm interested, thank you, Chair. I'm interested in your determination that the SDR is still the right SDR for this time. You've just listed a load of commitments that actually have been made since, Coalition of the Willing. We've obviously, got commitments around the High North now that we didn't have when this SDR was written. So how do you square the fact that actually the world has changed? I've heard, various people say to me, the SDR is out of date already. How do you, what's your take on that?
You want to take?
Yes, so I think that's nonsense. The Strategic Defence Review articulates the transformation of UK defence for war in the 21st century. And at the heart of it is the architecture of how you do war in the 21st century that has been evidenced again just now in the war in Iran as well as the war in Ukraine. So at the heart of the review is the articulation of we'll build defence around a digital, in this review it's called a targeting web, the rest of the world calls it a digital kill web, any sensor connected by data to any effector. And those sensors and effectors are this evolution from people manning platforms to crewed, uncrewed and autonomous systems, increasingly autonomous systems, in a high-low mix. And that's broadly now well understood. That's the heart of how the review transforms defence in the biggest transformation for 150 years. That holds good in all outcomes. What I think you're addressing here is not the direction of the SDR, it's the speed at which it has to go and the volume of things it has to cover.
I think the challenge to that, though, is that this is supposed to be a costed plan, and what we've seen in the last year is more commitments that cost money, basically. So how do you you can't have it both ways. This is the right plan, but actually the envelope doesn't meet the mark.
So that is not the problem of the SDR. That is a problem of implementation, but it's absolutely the vital issue. because the...
You guys told us that this was a costed plan. Like, I asked
yes,
you that.
Yes, so it's the costed plan for delivery over 10 years. And that remains broadly the case now. That's no longer the issue.
But it doesn't meet the moment in terms of the things that we actually now need to do.
So this is also true. The issue is the SDR, as it's settled on the financial profile that was given, produced UK to a minimal place. And we must remember that the dip in the SDR isn't the entire defence iceberg, it's the top half of it, a minimal place by about 2035. What we're all talking about is a world that's on fire now, and if you're ready by 2035, that's a shame, because the war may start in 2030. So what we're talking about is not changing the direction of travel in defence. We're talking about accelerating it and expanding it, because the world means you have to do it faster. That is a different, and I think very pressing issue.
Okay. Can I just ask one more question, Chair? Obviously, this was a novel approach. You guys coming in as an independent team. You know, this has never been done before. You sat independently of the MOD to deliver this SDR, which was obviously, the government were very proud of that approach. But fundamentally, has this approach failed?
So first of all, we were never independent. We were working for the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary. We were external. And we had to answer the two questions. What do you need to do, which is the transformational narrative, and then the harder question, and what do you get for this money? So we could not have argued, because it wasn't in our terms of reference, that, okay, so you need more money sooner. That's the debate we're now having. And there's a whole world of difference, as we found, between being independent and being external. We were not independent.
Okay, and had we been independent, it would have been just another think tank report. But we were doing it, with the department, not to the department. So we had a team. So we were able to be bold and imaginative about what we were proposing. But it's a wholesale transformation of the department. But we were working with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, as well as the Defence Secretary, going through that, so that at the end of the day, you produced a report that was implementable and not simply a good think tank report on the shelf.
Right, thank you much. Quickly on to Lincoln Job.
General, I think that we had a conversation at the first session where you and Lord Robertson came here, and I remember asking, 2.5% is the answer. Now, what's the question? And I also asked whether that was all for transformation, or whether you had any responsibility for filling in the potholes in the programme. And you said absolutely not. That's not what we're here to do. And it seems that from your initial report and then this sort of tug of money with the MOD, there seems to have been CDS sort of wanting more money for his existing programme because he's got ships that he needs to put out to sea and planes he wants to put in the air, and that the money for transformation sort of got dragged back into the here and now of readiness. Is that, have I got that wrong, or is that part of the dynamic that we're seeing here?
So the primary purpose of the Strategic Defence Review is to chart this course, which is common to all outcomes. This is how you transform defence for war in the 21st century. And that takes you to the sort of architecture I described. The operational challenge for the MOD remains that they have what they have today, which is the rather thin set of inventory as a result of the journey through the post-Cold War era. And so when their allies say we need to be ready sooner, by 2030, then of course they need to fill in some holes. And that was always part of the debate. But what we would have never have counselled is, let's not talk about transformation, let's just fill in some holes. Nor would we have countenanced, let's just do a digital kill web and let's not have any ammunition. That doesn't work. But this whole debate then turns on the fact that at the heart of the review and its implementation is the fact that the world, our opponents and our allies, say you've made commitments, Atlantic Bastion, Strategic Reserve Corps, contribution to NATO air and space component. You have an obligation in Article 3. You've made alliance commitments. Your Prime Minister says NATO could be attacked by 2030. And yet right now you're actually going backwards because you're not spending any new money sooner. And you've gone from major NATO spender to 12th in the order, and ranked against your capability targets, you are 31 of 32, just above Iceland that doesn't have armed forces. So the difficult debate is how do you implement the direction of travel of the SDR fast enough to deter our enemies and stay in place in step with our allies and be the leading influence that we keep claiming to be. And that brings you back to the money, which is, if you want to do that, find more money sooner, make different choices.
Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Ian Room, please.
Yeah, thank you. Given lessons learned from all this process, for me, outside of the process at the beginning, I would have thought that it would have been better if the dip was done in conjunction with the SDR to stop all this year confusion with industry, so to give industry clarity. What would you say is lessons learned from not doing it that way around?
So, in the execution of the SDR process, every day, or almost all day, every day, we were having a conversation about how the money that was available to us was fitted into the run. So that's essentially the precursor to the dip. So when the dip process started, it was on the basis of the outcome of the defence. It was just going to become more granular and deal with actual money over time, and actually have to put money against specific programs over time that you could contract against. So the review was essentially concurrent with setting the parameters of the dip. And then what happened in the dip, this lost year, was, and it was clear by, I think, August last summer, that there was an enormous gap once they had looked at the figures again, added some new things in, had to bring some things forward because of the 2030. There was a gap. Let's say it was £24 billion over 4 years. A gap between what the review required to do the 62 recommendations over time, over the first 4 years, and the amount of money the government wanted to find in those first 4 years. Now, since we knew no new money for the first 2 years, then only a dribble more in the rest of this Parliament, that wasn't a surprise. But what it exposed was a really clear choice. If you want to implement this review, and you said you do, then you're going to have to find more money sooner. If you can't find more money sooner, and it's not can't, it's won't, if you won't find more money sooner, then what would you like to cut from the review you just announced? And they went round that circle 3 times a week, every week, between September and basically the announcement. And that, for me, was just not good enough.
And from the beginning, do you wish that we'd have had some quick wins with the SDR? So announcing the SDR and saying, actually, we could have got some quick wins here to give credibility to the SDR.
So I do wish that we had money set aside for some of the bigger, more transfer. I would have moved faster on the digital targeting web, for example, because I don't think it's really difficult. I would have put more money into the attritable drones, so the drones that come back, which have just appeared in the dip for the Navy, the Air Force and the Army, but you know they're in the programme. But what was actually far more disappointing was that it took months to appoint the National Armaments Director, who is the key figure in the delivery of this with industry. So people could hide behind, they hadn't got a DIP, they hadn't got a National Armaments Director. And the loss of momentum, I think, was really deeply regrettable.
The National Armaments Director gave evidence in the last few weeks to the House of Lords International Relations and Defence Committee, and did impress us with the drive and enthusiasm that he had. But there is no doubt at all that the early delay in the appointment of the National Armaments Director slowed things down. I think the other thing that the committee needs to pay attention to at the moment is that our nuclear forces take up at least 20% of the MOD budget, maybe even 25% of the budget. It is crucially important to the security of this country, and indeed to the wider Europe, that we have that independent nuclear deterrent, the only one that is committed to NATO. But it is very, very expensive, and that therefore crowds out a lot of the other ambitions that the country might want to have at the moment. But it needs to be seen in the broader context. If we're going to have an independent nuclear deterrent, we've got to be able to pay the price of that and face the fact that it squeezes the conventional defence of the country and our wider contribution to NATO very much more tightly.
Yeah. So if NATO, if we want to be ready to face action with Russia's aggression against NATO by 2030 as being suggested, then what integrated air and missile defence systems must we be developing in these 4 years to be ready? Is £790 million good enough? I suggest not, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
So, so the first important point you raised there is the UK doesn't own the clock now on when we need to be. It's set by, I think, Russia and likely on the back of an outcome in Ukraine, which is why people talk credibly about 2030 or even sooner. So that's an uncomfortable view in Whitehall, where you may have to make different spending choices faster than you're comfortable with because your opponents have decided that's how the game is going to be played. And that removes the leisure from the 10-year programme. On the subject of integrated air and missile defence, it also alludes to this absolutely vital point that gets lost so often, which is the Defence Investment Plan is the articulation of the SDR. It's the things that made the cut for the money available. Given the legacy holes in defence, there's at least another half of the iceberg which never made it into the dip because it wasn't even remotely affordable. So a 60 to 80 billion pound hole in defence infrastructure, falling down at airfields, ports, housing, reserve forces and cadets association. Most of that is not in the dip because it just couldn't get into the cut. Integrated air and missile defence is the iconic thing that didn't make it into the review. So there's about £1 billion in the dip for this, and what that buys is improved command and control. You'll know better that you're going to be hit by a missile. Some improvements for the Air Force ability to shoot down cruise missiles. Some improvements to the Type 45 that has a better capability against ballistic missiles. But I think many people in the country assume there's a sort of Iron Dome over London at least, and it's not even remotely there. The cost of an Iron Dome, even if you embrace the extraordinary technological change which some companies are producing in producing low-cost kills, whether it's directed energy weapons, Dragonfire, or cheaper missiles like Cambridge Aerospace, that kind of thing. But entry level, probably £80 billion over 10 years, entry level. IMD of my dreams, probably £120 billion over 10 years. And we got £1 billion because it sits in that bit of the iceberg that never got to be remotely affordable. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that if we have an argument about the margins of the dip, that we're somehow fixing defence. It's just not true.
And finally,
in the review that I did in 1998, we didn't talk about homeland defence at all. We're an island, we're surrounded by water, we have a moat around us, and we're a long way from trouble. The reality now is very different. Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty is relevant to us, looking after our own defence as a contribution to collective defence, and that is there, and it's Chapter 6 in the Defence Review, and I believe the government are going to produce some resilience plan next
we will be coming back onto this, Lord Robertson, later on
next week. But the fact is that technology in missiles has now changed, so that Iran, using an old, an out-of-date Russian system, tried to fire a ballistic missile at Diego Garcia, 2,000 kilometres away. So we are now within range in a way that we weren't before. But as Richard has said, this is a huge iceberg that was way beyond our capability and the terms of reference that we had. But it's a problem that the nation will have to face in the future.
As a platform for delivering what the UK defence needs, is the Defence Investment Plan better or worse than the previous incarnation in the Defence Equipment Plan?
It's way better. it does two things that are really important. It cleaves to the transformational narrative of the SDR. And it says this regularly in the, we aren't challenging this direction we need to go in. And if you watch the US hitting 1,000 targets a day in Iran, that's a digital targeting web in action. So we know we have to get down there. The second thing is it has, unlike predecessors, accelerated the move into hybrid Navy, hybrid carrier air wing. For the Army, the transition to the CGS's 20-40-40 model, 20% crude, 40% attritable, 40% consumable. It makes that transition, and it starts. And where it falters is that it doesn't do enough quick enough by a long way.
Thank you.
And just to finish off then, I know your expertise in advocation for digital targeting web. How do you place that in future warfare?
So what we call in the web the digital targeting web, and I regret we had to settle on the word targeting because it implies that it's just to do with targeting. Actually, the digital kill web, a word I prefer, is the architecture of command and control now. It's how you understand your operating environment, how you take decisions, how you decide what you shoot at, how you maneuver, how you support, how you coordinate, how you train. So it's that architecture. And what it essentially does is it takes every form of thing or capability that senses the operating environment, so satellite, aircraft, drone, mobile phone, ship, vehicle, database, it doesn't matter. Everything that allows you to understand your operating environment and networks it into a database in secure cloud managed by AI. Without AI, you can't manage this. Supervised by clever people. And that capability allows you to assemble an understanding of your operating environment to support your decision making, including allocating, ranking targets and allocating them to weapon systems, whether they're kinetic from any service or non-kinetic like a cyber attack.
Thank you very much. We've really got to move on because I think time is going to defeat us. Otherwise, we've got less than an hour. I know that we've got a hard stop at 11:30. Right, on to Fred Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick one. Lord Robertson, you spoke just before about how the UK provides the nuclear deterrent for all of our European allies, and you commented on how expensive that is and how it squeezes the rest of our defence capabilities. So we provide that for countries, Poland, Germany, the Baltics, the Nordics. In Turkey this week, maybe our Prime Minister might be coming under some pressure around our defence spending, and yet it's us who provides that nuclear deterrent. Having been Secretary General of NATO yourself, how realistic or not would it be to start a conversation around, well, if you guys are all spending so well on defence, would you like to chip in? Would you like to support this pan-Europe nuclear deterrent that currently the British taxpayer alone provides?
Well, by and large, the Americans provide the nuclear umbrella, the big nuclear umbrella. But we add to that because our nuclear deterrent is committed to NATO as a whole. But the answer to your question is that of course other countries would then want to have a say, and NATO bureaucracy would want to have a say over our independent nuclear deterrent. And up to now, we have said that it has to be under the control of the Prime Minister, even in a situation where we were committed to defending NATO as well. But it is an area that should be looked at, because I think it is too often ignored and forgotten about by other nations that we do that. The French force de frappe is very much national, under national control and committed to nobody else. And although President Macron in his last year has been making vague talks about making it a European deterrent, he hasn't in any way specified how that might be done. Ours is committed to NATO as a whole. But I think it might well be that some arrangement might have to be made in order to make sure that the costs that we are bearing at the moment, in the event that America might not be seen as being ultimately reliable, would be the nuclear umbrella for Europe.
Brilliant. Thank you much. On to Lincoln Jock.
Can we talk about the politics of the threat and resourcing defence, because I think from your defence review sort of was talking about a national conversation and really ramping up the discussion of it in order to make the corollary, the investment in defence, that much more palatable. That doesn't seem to have happened at all. And I think we see the Chief of the Defence Staff on Remembrance Sunday, and it breaks into print every now and again. But in terms of being brutally honest about the threat and possibly less honest about our inability currently to meet it, nevertheless, should we be much more forthright in the national discussions about the threats that we face?
I think we must and we should. I've constantly reminded the Prime Minister over the last year since our report came out about the national conversation being necessary. But there was a big debate going on in the background about the DIP and about the money that was going to be allocated, and that seemed to divert attention. But unless the country knows how dangerous the world is and how dangerous it is for people in this country, then they will not transmit to the Treasury the priority that should be given to defence expenditure. But our report, remember that our report articulates a view of His Majesty's government was quite explicit. We say the UK and its allies are once again directly threatened by other states with advanced military forces. The UK is already under daily attack with aggressive acts. So that we've said that. The government has said that. The Prime Minister, in his speech at Munich, made it clear that we needed to move faster into hard defence in order to be able to meet the challenges. But it just didn't get to the point where he said, well, and therefore we will pay the money.
And plans without resources are hallucinations. Given that there is this funding shortfall, is what is planned a coherent, general? Is it a force you could fight? You're often described as the best CDS we never had, and I agree with that. And so, is this a force that you could fight? And we took evidence the other day from someone who said, the plan used to be to win and win quickly, and now because drone warfare has basically means that you just get mired in the kill box, that actually probably what we should be looking at is putting down these kill boxes in order to mitigate the risk that we've got to build up our conventional forces, which we're planning on doing to 30 to 35, but which we need to do because there has been something happening.
I think it's a very complicated question because we are in uncharted waters of this transformation and how you fight in the digital age. I think it is absolutely wrong to try and model the UK armed forces on what you see in Ukraine or what you saw in Iran. Every war has its own features, its own geography, its own limitations. So I think the important place to focus is on the jobs the UK armed forces actually have in the review from NATO, so the Atlantic Bastion. And the Royal Navy has planned for the Atlantic Bastion to evolve quickly into a hybrid navy, so crewed, uncrewed, autonomous, above the water, under the water, in the sky, is absolutely the right direction to travel. The challenge is, will they be in a good enough place, not just to fight, because they always will, but to endure by the time the enemy sets the bar, which is a possible confrontation with Russia. For the army, which is in by far the worst shape of the three services, the thing that the current SACEUR wants more than anything else from the UK is the Strategic Reserve Corps. And he's said this again and again. And that corps currently exists of about 2 brigades with a mixed fleet. So the Challenger 3 tank doesn't exist yet, a couple of years. The artillery is coming, a couple of years. So the CGS's direction of travel, they absolutely get this. Their problem is they're looking at the clock and they're looking at their program and they don't meet. They are out of kilter. And the same for the scale endurance of the Air Force. So the prescription is good. It's the delivery versus the clock set by the opponents where the floor is.
Thank you.
Thank you much. On to Michelle Scrobham.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on Lord Robertson's comment about the Prime Minister telling people about the threat, do you think saying it and actually articulating it in a way that the public understands is the same thing?
No, it's not, because a national conversation as we envisaged it would involve an articulation of what the threat was. You know, the answer to the question is in the Strategic Defence Review. It lays out what the threat is, it lays out where we are at the moment, and then it provides the answer, you know, through each of the services, as well as acquisition, people policy, and the rest of it. So we need to make sure that people know that there is an actual threat, and more than just, you know, the entry point of the Strategic Defence Review, and it needs to be repeated. So some of us have been doing that, you know, and members of this committee, I dare say, are also involved in that process. But it needs to be much bigger, much more ambitious, much more relentless in the message that it takes over, both about the threat, but how we actually deal with it.
Do you think not just the public in general, but colleagues and MPs on the benches here physically understand where the threat is coming from and what we're facing?
Well, I made a speech that got a bit of notice recently in Salisbury, and I pointed out that there was in this country, I think, if I could quote my words, because they got a bit distorted. There is a corrosive complacency today in Britain's political leadership. Now, that was taken by the Financial Times as an attack on the government, but it actually applies to the whole political leadership. I wrote to the leader of the Liberal Democrats in December last year, and I finally met him a couple of weeks ago. I wrote to the leader of Reform UK in December last year, and I'm still waiting for the meeting, although his defence spokesman has said he was interested in a meeting. So there is a degree of complacency in the country as a whole, which I think is very, very dangerous, and people need to be woken up.
My concern is that it's not coming from the top. So when I asked the Chief of Defence Staff why we're not letting the public know what the threats are, his response was, we don't want to alarm people, and I would suggest they should be alarmed.
I would agree with you. I think we need to alarm people, because as the review said, we are under daily attack at the present moment, and that will be ramped up. Dr. Jade McGlynn of King's College, who is a great expert on Russia and Russian domestic opinion, points out that we are being used inside Russia today. This country is being used as a proxy for all of the forces that are ranged against Russia at the present moment. So it sort of leads up in many ways to the kind of rhetoric that we got about Ukraine before the invasion of Ukraine. And she sort of says quite clearly that in the sub-threshold area, cyber attacks, targeted assassinations, attacks on our pipelines, undersea pipelines, all of these things are now on the agenda because Russia sees the United Kingdom as being its principal main adversary at the moment.
I'm neither a public servant nor a politician, so I can speak my mind on this. So I think, first of all, we're dealing with a failure of politics across the piece, a failure of political leaders to commit to understanding this problem, because many people don't want to. And then, secondly, and more egregiously, a failure to articulate it to their voters, because I think many politicians think there's no mileage in it, there's no votes in that. But you can't be in a world where you can say, if you're the Prime Minister, Russia could attack NATO in 2030 and then talk about a whole of society battle of wills and then just let that dangle. So in the absence of politics doing what I would hope that it could do, I think there are two courses left, and no one will listen to a word I say. So I've basically given up expecting to get any traction. But events will get traction. and we are attacked every day, and so we're hostage to events. And secondly, the world of entertainment. If you look at the Netflix film House of Dynamite, there are ways of reaching into the public consciousness which are more effective than anything I ever do. And I think that might work.
And he and I have been involved in the Sky Television plan that will be coming out in September, called The War Game. I think it'll remind people about how grave the danger is.
Can I ask, so obviously we've had well-documented conversations about the gap in the funding for the DIP. The extra 15 billion has been provided, and there's been a lot of criticism that doesn't go far enough. How much do you see the relationship between Treasury and MOD being the problem in all of this? Do they communicate and work well together? What's really going on there?
So there's always been for my entire adult life, a difficult relationship between the Treasury, juggling all aspects of public spending for 20 years with a stagnant economy and a very large public sector, and Defence, which will always work out why it needs more money and then has been criticised for not spending it well. And I accept that. They just don't need to do it any longer. But I think that is the wrong level of argument. What I'm looking for is a government, a cabinet, that understands the strategic landscape, can realise that this is uncomfortable and they didn't want it, but they've got to make some hard choices, and can then make those hard choices stick across its administration. And hoping that defence officials and Treasury officials will somehow work all this out themselves without there being a major societal and political discussion about the choices that we make, I think is doomed to fail.
Well, at an early stage in our review, I said to our team, remember that we have to convince the Treasury, more than anything else, we have to convince the Treasury that any extra money is going to be wisely and properly used. So put yourself in the mind of Treasury. And remember, we had a very senior Treasury official as part of our review 6 year. We had 6 experts helping us. So we had a very senior Treasury official there, and he was extremely useful during the process. So they think if you just give money to defence, it's wasted. It goes into programmes that are overcost, that are over elaborate. They get added to. They're rarely delivered on time, and to do that. So we have to focus on that. And I appointed Sir Jeremy Quinn, who had been one of the defence ministers in the last administration, Defence Procurement Minister, one of the 16 they had from 2010 to 24, in order to look at that. And therefore, the Strategic Defence Review looks at that, about reforming acquisition, to make sure that we don't have a situation like the Type 23 frigates that are being built in Glasgow today, which were the backdrop for the launch of the SDR last June. That it's a basic, simple frigate that can be sold elsewhere, uncomplicated, but it took 20 years from the start of the drawing board to the delivery of the ships. So we looked at that. So the Strategic Defence Review and the acquisition side reforms the whole way in which we do it. And the National Armaments Director giving advice to the Lords Committee was clear that was one of his priorities in order to solve the problem, and therefore undermine the sort of basic Treasury argument against giving money to defence.
Do you think that's worked?
Well, it is working. I think that Rupert Pearce, who is the National Armaments Director, means well, and he was able to articulate an argument to members of the Lords Committee that was highly convincing. I hope that will be the case, but we need still to get the message over to the Treasury that actually the SDR solves the problem that they perennially see in relation to defence.
Thank you.
Right, brilliant. Thank you very much. General Barrons, in response to Mr. Room, you intimated that the Defence Investment Plan here is actually better than previous defence equipment plans. However, there is a palpable lack of detail within the DIP. For example, there is no full 10-year expenditure profile, there is no breakdown between procurement and support costs, and there's a lot of backloading going on, so there's a serious lack of detail. Why do you think government has failed in that endeavour? Is there something to hide by not giving us as a committee and the wider public that level of detail?
So I think we'd really have to ask the government where they drew the line on the level of detail, but the Defence Investment Plan as an internal MOD document is an enormous spreadsheet, and it'll be classified at secret and UK eyes, I imagine, because the detail that's in there is profoundly interesting to industry and capital, so it's commercially sensitive. It's profoundly interesting to allies and to opponents. So I understand the dilemma of how much you put in the public domain and how much you keep in-house, and they were never going to publish the entire
it's not about publishing the entire thing. I mean, previously we've had on an annual basis the Defence Equipment Plan, which lays out, including to our committee here and to our predecessor committees, that level of detail. We're not looking for secret or classified versions, which the Defence Committee can engage with the Ministry directly. But this is just a headline.
Yes.
Statement,
so perhaps if you were to ask, that level of detail would come next. Put one rider with that. If you look at the role that the National Armament Director has, for the first time and by design, he owns innovation. He owns acquisition in the tiered way that's been described. He owns logistics and infrastructure, and the reason he has that set of things is that we're deliberately broken out of a world where you would buy a thing and then you'd have a separate argument about the 2/3 of the programme cost, which was about its support, and that would allow you to nakedly, entryism would apply and buy a thing and then worry about how you pay for it. So he's got a much better tool set, and therefore he may be able to present the information about the life cycle of capability, particularly where capability is on a very rapid burn, right, in a different way. It's no longer just about buying big bits of kit in a leisurely cycle.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mike Martin.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'd like to talk about alignment between the SDR and the DIP. So I've got a couple of specific examples I will come to, but in general terms, how well do you think the DIP is aligned on delivering the priorities that you articulate in the SDR? Lord Robertson.
Broadly speaking, it does, because as General Barrons has said, the wholesale transformation and the creation of the digital spine and the targeting web and all of that, they are all there, and the commitment to it is there. So the structure of the transformation has been protected. The question is whether or not the resources are going to be attached to it. What you don't want are sort of gestures being made towards what we say.
For example, on the digital targeting web, only 7.5 billion before 2030, massively backloaded 17 billion after 2030, as yet unfunded. Would that be an example of that?
So that's probably more for me. So if you take the constituent parts of the digital targeting web, you're going to start with the things you already have. And Defence already has sensors, and it already has weapons, and it has some architecture in terms of data sensors, early use AI tools, the services that provides that Palantir can provide. So they're going to start by stitching together those things that they have, and then they need to work out how they evolve that. Now, most of that technology will be the application of things that have been invented in the private sector, data, AI, those kinds of things. So there's not a whole lot of new innovation in there. There is an argument, and it's a very vibrant one, about what's the best mix. So in terms of what you're going to spend that 7.5 billion on, do you mean sensors? Do you mean effectors? Do you mean the data architecture? Do you mean the
Do they articulate that in the DIP? They don't.
So they don't articulate it in the DIP, and I think that's probably a good thing, because if they were sure, they'd be wrong. right now. And I think what they need to focus on is gluing things together first. And crucially, not just with the UK, but with our NATO allies. The targeting web is an instrument of interoperability. It's not just a national exercise.
And just back to this theme that I started with, Lord Robertson, are there any gaps in the DIP in terms of what you expected to see based on the vision of the SDR?
Well, the other gaps, in terms of the vision that we put forward, the overall vision, it's all articulated. But you know, the relatively small amounts being allocated to a lot of these things, you know, are an indication of future progress. The new combat ship is designed for delivery in the mid 2030s, which is beyond the 2030 date that we've now got to work on.
And just on that, our current 45s are going out of service in 2035. Yet we have a new suite of, the hybrid Navy, the CCVs and the Type 90Xs that are going to cluster around that. I mean, currently that's a PowerPoint. So 9 years from PowerPoint to power projection on the high seas, does that seem realistic? And does that speak to the SDR, do you think?
So I think we should see this as an opportunity. So if you take the Type 45, it's probably the last of its kind. It's £1 billion and a bit more for the ship with a very impressive radar on it and a magazine that probably carries around 40 missiles. And that predates the world we're now in, which is the crewed-uncrewed autonomous mix. And given the speed at which this technology is changing in the high-low mix of munitions in particular, what the Navy is arguing for is not a replacement like for Type 25, it's a replacement contribution to integrated air and missile defence. So there'll be a cruise ship in there somewhere, but most of their bets will be on uncrewed and increasingly autonomous platforms that carry the radar or
Got it, but specifically on my question, 9 years from PowerPoint to being
honestly,
at sea.
I think 9 years is leisurely. Look at what happened in Ukraine. I think you're capturing there how this whole world is changing from episodic 30-year cycles to replace capital platforms to a world where the armed forces will constantly evolve at the speed of innovation, which is benchmarked by what your opponents have, and in the near term, probably Russia. Medium term, it's definitely China, and where technology can give you an edge. And for the sorts of money we're talking about, if you give the Royal Navy 9 years and you tell them it's not like you did, it's like you need to do now, they'll deliver on that with industry.
So if it is 9 years, is 1.3 billion enough then over the next 4 years to kickstart that project?
Yes, so I think that's the more strategic question, which is if you look at the DIP, it captures the direction of the SDR as we've discussed.
Yeah.
It does that really well. It makes and accelerates some early moves, but they're small in number, and then a lot of it is too leisurely for the world we live in. And the question there are two questions only that really matter. One is, well, if your war may start in 2030 and you're planning to be ready in 2035, go a bit quicker. Yep. And secondly, you have to keep your eye on the things that never made it into the DIP, because they really matter too.
For example?
IMD, which we talked about, most of the...
It went down, it was $1 billion in the SDR, wasn't it, and 700 and something million in the DIP, so that's straight, I mean, that's just a factual drop.
So I wouldn't want to quote the ammunition figures and I'd be wrong, but the amount of money the DIP spends on munitions of all types is going to be substantially less than the amount of ammunition the services would want to hold. They would want 30-day stocks. They want, and then they'd know how to. So in infrastructure, in logistics, and the thing that nobody ever talks about, which is the most hollowed out bit of defence medical services. So if you're planning to put the Strategic Reserve Corps on continental Europe, then you must know how the casualties and there will be casualties that come from the back end of the SRC are get to an NHS bed, and that assumes the NHS is ready to receive, and there's a system to move mass casualties. I can't see where that exists. That's not in the DIP.
Final question, Lord Robertson. I mean, you've done 2 defence reviews, so this is, you have a really interesting perspective on this. a very common criticism of the way that the UK political class, to use your earlier framing, approaches defence, and particularly the reductions since the end of the Cold War, is to salami slice. And we just cut a little bit off each, and we end up with not much mass, and there's not enough to do anything. And are we not now just doing the opposite in reverse, where we're just penny packeting and adding little bits to everything to build them up slowly, and it's going to end up with the same result? We're not going to end up with a force that we can fight with.
Well, we will have a force to fight with when the day comes. And it may well be that it takes a crisis to mobilise opinion and finance to do it. Yeah, that is the horrible reality that we live with. 9/11 was a wake-up call on global terrorism, and it changed a lot. It changed NATO when I was there quite substantially, and the way the enlargement took place. And if people become aware of the dangers and the risks that apply to this country, then they will make the demands that will allow us to do it. The generals, and this one not excluded, will always say, we'll take it on, we'll do it, but we might do it badly, and that's what I worry about. The Secretary of State in the DIP says the hard truth is that this government inherited a defence programme was underfunded, overcommitted and insufficiently attuned to the threats that we now face. So that is the reality. 2 years on, they're still hollowed out, and yet the government is saying that we could volunteer them for a coalition of the willing in a post ceasefire Ukraine.
Which is fanciful, right?
Well, it's not fanciful, because the military would want to do it, and at that point, maybe there will be a wake-up call that is involved in it. But it shouldn't. We shouldn't be taking risks in that way with human beings who are serving in our forces.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Right, on to Alex Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I have the great pleasure of having Standing Joint Command in my patch in Aldershot, the 3-star headquarters, which obviously is the national headquarters for Homeland Defence. So I took particular interest in Chapter 6 of the SDR and the focus on Homeland Defence. But when it's come to looking at then the DIP, obviously when it comes to commitments on Homeland Defence and resilience, it appears pretty sparse. Is that because much of the responsibility of delivering Homeland Defence doesn't sit with the MOD, but actually sits with other government departments?
So I think that is the first conclusion, which is in a world where we have to take Homeland resilience seriously under Article 3, and we understand resilience is the foundation of credible deterrence. We hadn't have to worry about that for 35 years. Now we do. So the headquarters in your constituency, which will evolve, as I understand it, become a proper joint Homeland headquarters. It will do the really important job of contributing to the military defence of the UK, although that's a shared responsibility, including with NATO. But crucially, what military support is provided to the resilience of the UK. So it supports mobilisation and endurance. But the great majority of Homeland resilience is absolutely, as you describe, not a military thing. Cyber resilience, the resilience of critical national infrastructure, cognitive resilience against social media manipulation. And it was made very clear during the review we should keep within our lane. What is it that the military do for the country and the country must do for the military? And the bit that's missing in this whole of society discussion is the recreation of our national resilience, where the vast majority of that is nothing to do with the MOD.
So, you talk about the total society approach. I mean, my view is we need to start with a total government approach, and work out from there. I'm interested in, I'm doing a lot of work around NATO Article 3, you know, our commitment to be prepared. Obviously, everyone knows NATO Article 5. Nobody has much awareness of NATO Article 3. How much awareness do you think government departments beyond the MOD understand our commitment to be prepared? And what is your assessment, you know, mark out of 10 for other government departments? Are there any government departments that you would call out for actually being, being proactive on this? And are there any government departments you actually think are just not on it at the moment?
Well, I'll say at the practitioner level, and leave the next level to George. So the bit that works is the National Cyber Security Centre. As a source of advice, it's very good, but it's the source of advice. It's not a fire brigade. If you look at the span of things the rest of the government must do to assure daily life in this country, can we get food and water and telecoms? Can we have access to space for our GPS? Can our digital architecture function? Can the population, who all have a smartphone, realise the nonsense that's being pumped at them in information operations? If you take that across government, on a good day, 2 out of 10.
Robertson?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, and I understand. I was at a briefing yesterday, and the National Resilience Plan is going to be published next Monday. So, you know, the home defence aspect, knitting together all of the different government departments, is going to be articulated. And that's good news. That's really excellent, because it requires every government department, you know, to do what it has to do. You know, I keep quoting to people. I spoke at the Wigtown Book Festival last November. Wigtown is in the southwest of Scotland, a small town with a big book festival. And I said to the audience, you know, have you all got a wind-up radio? Have you all got cash? Have you got your torches in every room? Have you got, you know, canned food to do with that? You know, so, you know, sort of people went on at me later on about, I've got my candles, you know, to do with that. But the key thing was, that was on the Friday night, wild Friday night. By the Tuesday, there were still 25,000 houses in northern Scotland without power. So they went through the same experience that Spain and Portugal did last September, when, for reasons that are still unknown, you know, their whole power supply went down, and people found they couldn't tap cards to make money. The traffic lights went out, you know, and all sorts of dislocation took place in society as a whole. So that requires a whole of society approach to deal with it. But the military aspects we deal with in the review, and as Richard has said, there are very specific things that the military can and should be doing, but it's got to be part and parcel of an overall policy. And I'm hopeful that next week the government is going to produce something that will be convincing.
Right. Well, it'll be interesting to see what is in that. I mean, one of the things that I think every government minister should have their national security responsibilities within their brief laid out, so that, you know, it is clear what they are accountable for within each and every role in government.
Every citizen as well. You know, it's not. You shouldn't. Everyone sort of says, leave it to the army. You know, when a crisis comes up, you know, floods or ticketing for the Olympic Games. You know, that we want to pass it on to local authorities or whatever, but we all have an individual responsibility. And just as in Finland and Sweden and in Norway, where it's baked in, you know, into the national psyche, in this country we need to get used to the fact that we are no longer immune, and that we're actually being targeted.
I just want to touch on the Defence Readiness Bill, because obviously that was part of Chapter 6 of the SDR. I think various of us on this committee were disappointed in the King's Speech to not have a Defence Readiness Bill in play in this sitting. What do you want to see within that Defence Readiness Bill when it does come forward?
So the Defence Readiness Bill is part of the articulation of how we return to a whole of society understanding about war in our time, that it's no longer something you just outsource to the uniformed military. So the first thing it must do is it must enable daily life to continue when the country is under assault, whether it's confrontational or conflict, above the threshold of military conflict, which is military stuff, and more than that, below the threshold. So it must be possible for the government to drive daily life in conditions of crisis where you can't allow everyone to make up their own mind whether they cooperate or not. The second thing is it must support mobilization. It must enable the armed forces to go from a position at ease today, relatively speaking, onto a war footing where you're drawing in reserves, you're dispersing people, you're moving equipment and people to the continent, you're beginning to take casualties. And then it must endure, because if you look at the experience of Ukraine, which is year 5 now, and so this is not like sallying forth into Libya or even an Afghan campaign, which was neatly bounded. This is war where it could run for years. There's very likely mass casualties. There's very likely big damage to the built environment, and readiness and resilience is about endurance as much as getting started. So all of those things. That was once common, I think, during the Cold War. People understood that's how war was. It's completely evaporated, and now we're resurrecting it pretty much from scratch.
And lastly, I just want to touch on the suggestion that government has reached 1.5% of NATO, the target on resilience spending. In your view, is that investment sufficient or is more needed?
It needs to be spelled out. Yeah. We'd all like to know. The Prime Minister has made the bold statement that the 1.5% has actually been achieved. He uses other articulations to do with the 3.5%, which are not particularly convincing and led to John Healey's resignation. But the 1.5%, he confidently says, has already been met, but has not actually told us how it's been met. And I, among others, would be very interested to know precisely how. And maybe round the North Atlantic Council table tomorrow, he'll tell President Putin, President Trump.
So from the perspective of defence infrastructure, it's clear what the money hasn't been spent on. It hasn't been spent on making places like Bryce Norton secure and effective, nor mending the military ports and expanding them yet. It hasn't been spent on gearing the NHS up to deal with mass casualties. It hasn't been spent on enabling mobilisation or forward-basing stock. So whatever the money has been spent on, it's hard to see in the military lane.
Thank you much. On to Emma Liu.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think you've both indicated that the DIP broadly implements the SDR recommendations, but that also there's important things missing from the DIP. So should a new Prime Minister and Cabinet relook at it or add to it and do a DIP Part 2?
Well, speaking as a politician, I think the new Prime Minister is going to have to look at the DIP again. Because whoever the new Prime Minister is, they're going to be confronted by allies in NATO, and especially by the American president, who is going to say, this is the letter that John Healey sent in resignation. So you, the new Secretary of State, you've got allegedly an extra 1.5 million, 0.02% more than John Healey got. What is this story about? Where is the plan that takes you to 3% to 3.5% by 9 years' time? I think we keep talking about 2035 as if it's a long distance away. The end of the decade is just 3.5 years to go, and 2035 is 9 years from now. So we're supposed to get to that point. And when you actually talk about the figures, to get to 3% would require an extra £21 billion a year on the defence budget, which is at the present moment £70 billion. To get to 3.5% requires £36 billion extra a year on the defence budget. So, the assumption by NATO and by the Americans is that we're going to have to plot our way, plan our way towards that, and that is where the dip is unconvincing. And John Healey made it absolutely clear in his letter that it falls well short of what is required for defence and this country at a dangerous time. And that that letter will be widely circulated throughout the people who are attending the NATO summit in Ankara tomorrow.
So, as a citizen taxpayer, I would want a new government to stop just talking about the ways and resources around defence. A bit more dip, a bit less dip. Open the SDR, don't open the SDR, and we need to talk about the outcomes that we've got to get to. And if the outcome is that we, the UK, as part of NATO, must be prepared to deter Russia from thinking it could attack European NATO at some point, and let's say it's around 2030 because it's linked to an outcome in Ukraine. So if we've got 3 or 4 years to be part of NATO credibly deterring Russia, which I think is pretty much what the Prime Minister has said, if you work back from that outcome, then the dip delivers a minimum outcome 5 years later than that. So there's nothing wrong with the direction of travel, it's the pace and the volume that would have to step up. And that's going to include the stuff that's in the dip but a bit shaky, you're going to have more of that, and then the stuff we'd have to look at that's not in the dip. And all of this is a very unfortunate and difficult discussion about how we didn't ask for it, very unpalatable. It's going to cause us to take money out of things that we like, but this is the world we live in. And if a new government fails to accept that imperative, it's going to be confronting in 3 years' time potential strategic failure, a failure of deterrence, potential operational failure, which is you put forces in the field as part of NATO and they lose, and you're going to be confronting a moral failure because you'll be sending today's armed forces, who are all somebody's children, into the field in 3 years' time, knowing that you decided not to prepare them properly, and as a result of that, more get killed and wounded than was necessary. And that, I think, is an underrated thought.
I draw the attention of members of the committee to an article in last Sunday's Observer by Sir Bernard Grey, who used to be the head of procurement in the Ministry of Defence, and at one point away in distant history was my special advisor as well. But a well-informed and somewhat worrying article, which I hope any new Prime Minister would read and take on board.
Thank you. Thank you much. Right, on to Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. We mentioned just before about how some countries do better than us at informing citizens about the need to be resilient. And the committee was recently in Norway a couple of weeks ago. So they do that much better in Norway, and they actually mandate that everyone has to have 7 days supply at home. So similar to what you're saying, Lord Robertson, but mandated. And they reckon they have, I can't remember what the uptake, they reckon they have maybe sort of 50-60%, less in cities, more rurally, for kind of obvious reasons. One of the other things they do in Norway is pass a budget through Parliament for defence. And obviously when we travel as a committee amongst our allies, thinking about when you go to America, France, etc., they pass budgets through Parliament or Congress or National Assembly. And it makes an enormous difference because it's cross-party support. It is a demand signal for industry. It takes the kind of decision-making pressure slightly away from the department, the government department. And also, in terms of that conversation on informing the public, it forces people's representatives to be debating publicly defence spending. Whereas in our parliament, we do it on this committee, and anyone outside of this committee does it by choice, normally because of having a constituency relevant interest in a particular part of the supply chain or what have you. So a question for yourself, Lord Robertson, do you think we should do that in the UK?
Yes, I think we should have a broader debate on a constant basis about defence, and that is the only way. And in a way that you will actually get a focus. You know, I spoke a couple of weeks ago to Labour MPs at the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting and pointed out that the dip was coming. At that point it had not been published, but that it was going to mean that domestic departments were going to basically be reduced in order to pay for the defence investment plan. And they better be ready for that. There was a huge row the first time round when the government used the development money, you know, in order to boost the defence at that point. And I think people need to know what the trade-offs actually are. So that the Norwegian, Swedish and Finland model is a good one in terms of involving the whole of public to get involved in it. Germany is going through that debate at the present moment. You know, they've abandoned their very strict limitations on borrowing in order to borrow more now in order to increase the defence expenditure, and therefore there is a live debate at that point going on. But unless there's a live debate, then those who are making the allocations and doing the trade-offs will be oblivious to the dangers and risks.
So I guess, I agree with that. I'm wondering if you would support a very radical change in the UK of how we come up with decisions around defence spending to have a budget that's passed through Parliament each year. And obviously that would be hugely different. I mean, even this defence investment plan we've had in the last couple of weeks, there is very little detail in it. Like much less detail than you'd have to put in something for it to pass through Parliament. So, you know, you compare it to the Americans and the French, how they do it. There's much more detail in those documents. And we have a culture in the UK, I think, of the MOD being very close-hold with information, not just in terms of classification, just in general. Much more circumspect about sharing decision-making processes, partly for reasons of reputation protection, partly for classification. But we are, in my view, in the past 2 years of being an MP, a massive outlier in our allies in that respect. I'm wondering if you would support, in theory, a change like that.
I would certainly be in favour of a greater degree of transparency and a wider debate taking place. You've got to keep some things relatively secret. If you take the 20% of the budget, maybe rising to 25% of the budget on the nuclear enterprise.
Just because we have time. America do it. They don't have a problem with classification in the Pentagon. They still put a budget through Congress. The French put a budget through National Assembly. They don't have a problem with classifications. I think the classification thing we sometimes is more of a cultural thing in the UK, in my view.
Yeah, we are far, in my view, my personal view, we are far too secretive about things that don't require it. You know, practically all the documentation we had was official sensitive. You know, so the moment that it falls into somebody's hands, it becomes a newspaper story. But it can be, this is Tuesday, official sensitive. Well, what the hell is this? So I think there is undoubtedly a culture that is there. If you take the defence nuclear enterprise, I have been arguing for a very lengthy period of time that there needs to be a greater degree of supervision of that budget. It takes up 20% of the whole defence budget. It's huge and it's big, but it's very, very confidential, inevitably, about that. And it is only now that the government as a whole has decided that there will be a specific committee that will be set up to look at it.
And we await further details on it.
Yeah.
General, if I could ask you a different question entirely about the SDR and Defence Investment Plan and taking them as one, putting them together, your views on priorities. And I asked the previous Defence Secretary this same question. So there's 62 recommendations in the SDR, and then we've seen the DIP and we've all looked at that really recently, so it's fresh in our minds. I'm going to ask you what you think the most important thing is in there. I'm also going to ask you what you think the least important thing is in there. And I know that you might want to respond, well, that's the wrong way of saying, wrong question, and we should be asking different questions. That is the question I'm asking. And you said several times that you're not a politician, so we're going to get a non-politician answer from you.
So that's a very difficult question to answer because it implies that within the current state of UK defence there's much left to give. And the honest truth is that the current state of defence reflects that journey through the post-Cold War era, which means that everything that could have gone has gone. And in many cases, it's held together by sellotape and goodwill. And so when you ask the question, what would you give up? Well, set aside the nuclear deterrent, and that's 25% of the budget. And we've made 3 big commitments: the Atlantic Bastion, the Strategic Reserve Corps, and the contribution to NATO's Air and Space Command. And we are not planning to make those contributions as viable as the alliance need them to be in time. In that, we'll get there in 10 years. We should be there in 5. I think trying to solve this problem by trying to skin things out is exhausted. And it was exhausted in that debate that ran from August last year until the dip came out. We've done that now. The second thing, which is currently sterile, is trying to find more public money. And it's not that from £1.4 trillion this year there isn't enough money in the public sector. It's just that in the way our politics works, nobody is willing to make those hard choices to rebalance from something, I would say welfare, into defence. So that's why we have found half the money that was needed to find the 28 billion in the dip. The conversation, which I think is much more productive but is a struggle to get going, is if you've exhausted the public sector and you can't cut anything else, now you have to engage the private sector. And there is some resistance to this, philosophically perhaps, but if you ask the city to find £50 billion over the next 4 years for things like infrastructure and logistics, they're ready to go. And they're ready to go not in a repeat of the old PFI bad outcomes for the taxpayer carrier. They're ready to go with new commercial vehicles, new ways of working, and they need some new rules with the Treasury. Our rules are the most restrictive in Europe. So I think the better answer to this question about how do we go faster sooner, right now, and I mean before recess, is for the government, this new government, to engage with the city in the way governments have done for 2,000 years when they need to pay for their wars.
Right, thank you much. Lord Robertson, a lot has been made by the government about